Have you ever felt like you were apologizing for your existence? Do you often shrink back when you enter a social space, as if you want to be smaller, lighter, and easier to manage? In psychology, we call that the silent wound, a scar that forms in childhood but leaves almost no visible marks. It is the wound of emotional neglect. Today, as a psychologist, we will delve into how silence shaped the person you are. We will explore how this wound reorganizes your nervous system and how you can start rewriting that story. Because the emptiness you feel is not a flaw, it is the echo of a connection that was missed. Let's begin this journey together to find the child who had to shrink themselves to survive. There is a quiet kind of wound that forms in childhood, one that rarely leaves visible scars yet shapes the entire architecture of a young person's inner world. It is the wound of being ignored. When a child grows up in the shadow of emotional absence, they slowly learn to see themselves through a distorted lens, a lens that tells them their needs are inconvenient, their feelings excessive, and their presence somehow too much for the room they stand in. As a psychologist who spends years studying the rebellious emotional landscapes of growing adolescence, I've seen how deeply this early silence seeps into adulthood. The ignored child often becomes the adult who instinctively shrinks the moment they step into a social space. As if apologizing for existing, they downplay their opinions, hesitate before expressing emotions, and brace themselves for disappointment even when success is already in their hands. The tragedy is not that they lack talent or value, but that their internal template was constructed in an environment where acknowledgement was rare and emotional resonance was absent. This internalized neglect schema becomes the quiet script that runs beneath every decision. The brain, shaped through repeated moments of being overlooked, learns to predict abandonment as a natural outcome. A child who is consistently met with silence begins believing that silence is what they deserve. It's not that they don't long to be seen, it's that they have learned not to ask. They grow up feeling that their needs complicate things, that their desires create pressure, that their emotions are burdens rather than bridges. So they adapt by erasing parts of themselves, trimming their personality down to something lighter, smaller, easier for others to manage. This adaptation may look like strength on the surface, quiet, obedient, self-contained, but beneath it lies a deep fear that any expression of authentic need might threaten the fragile connections they rely on. Many teenagers who come to therapy describe this sensation perfectly. The more they grow, the more invisible they feel. It is as if their childhood taught them to disappear in order to belong. And yet, this is only the beginning of the story. To understand how powerful this early absence truly is, we must go deeper into the subtle forms of emotional neglect. Those moments of silence and distraction that look harmless from the outside but shape a child's entire emotional identity from within. Because the greatest wounds of neglected children are not always born from cruelty, but from the quietness that fills the spaces where connection should have been. Emotional neglect is one of the most misunderstood forms of childhood wounding. Precisely because it so often hides in plain sight. It is rarely dramatic, rarely loud, and almost never the kind of story that earns sympathy. In many families, no one is yelling, no one is hitting, and no one looks like a villain. Yet something vital is missing. A child asks a question and receives no response. Their excitement is met with distracted eyes. Their small triumphs disappear into the noise of a parent absorbed in exhaustion, work, or a glowing phone screen. Even events meant to mark belonging, birthdays, school performances, moments of pride, pass by with minimal recognition. Because there is no obvious conflict, the child assumes the problem must be them. This is how emotional neglect becomes a fault line beneath the surface of a young person's identity. What makes this so damaging is that children do not interpret neglect the way adults do. An adult can rationalize, blame stress, or understand external circumstances. A child cannot. To the child, being ignored is not an inconvenience, it is a statement about their worth. A missed response becomes a message. Your voice does not matter here. A lack of eye contact becomes, you're not worth my attention. And over time, these tiny moments compile into a profound conclusion: I must not be important. This is the foundation upon which their self-concept begins to form. As they adapt, Children learn survival strategies that appear harmless but carry emotional consequences into adolescence and beyond. They quiet their needs, not because they don't have them, but because they no longer believe anyone will care. They stop asking for help, not out of confidence, but because they expect disappointment. They hide their hurt with a maturity that is deceptive, praised even, yet rooted in the fear that revealing too much will lead to more emotional absence. In essence, they shrink themselves to fit the emptiness around them. What's most tragic is that this adaptation is not healing. It is camouflage. Ignoring one's needs does not erase them, it only buries them deeper. Where they quietly shape behaviors, expectations, and relationships well into adulthood. And though many young people believe they have grown out of these patterns, the truth is that the wounds simply changed form. To understand just how far-reaching these consequences can be, we must explore the biological and developmental needs that were left unmet, and the ripple effect these unmet needs have on the nervous system, emotional regulation, and long-term psychological well-being. A child's emotional world is built upon three essential pillars: safety, stimulation, and connection. Safety gives the nervous system permission to grow. Stimulation helps the mind expand, experiment, and imagine. But it is connection, the experience of being seen, heard, and valued, that becomes the core blueprint for a person's sense of self. When that connection is missing, even if the environment appears stable or materially sufficient, the child's inner architecture begins to take shape around a void. They learn early that their feelings echo into empty spaces, that their words fall without landing, and that their presence rarely generates warmth or response. This absence of emotional resonance becomes a quiet teacher, shaping their expectations for every relationship that follows. Attachment theory, widely explored by John Bowlby, explains that a child who repeatedly encounters emotional absence internalizes a painful belief: I am not worth loving, or sometimes, my needs inconvenience people. These beliefs do not come from logic, they grow from experience. Each unanswered call, each moment of being talked over or brushed aside, wires the brain toward the expectation of dismissal. What many underestimate is how deeply biological this wound becomes. The nervous system, especially in childhood, is incredibly sensitive to relational feedback. When a child is ignored, particularly during moments of emotional activation, the stress system spikes, cortisol rises, the body enters a state of alertness, and over time the brain adapts by making this heightened vigilance its default state. This neurological recalibration has long-term consequences. A child whose emotions were consistently unmet may grow into an adult who struggles to regulate their inner world. They experience anxiety not as fleeting discomfort but as a baseline. Their emotional threshold becomes fragile, and small challenges feel overwhelming because the nervous system was never taught how to settle through connection. Instead of turning to others for support, they turn inward, where doubt, fear, and self-blame often speak louder than reassurance. This is why emotional neglect is far more than a psychological event, it is a biological imprint. When connection is absent, the brain does not simply feel lonely, it reorganizes itself around that loneliness. The child becomes hyper-aware of cues that signal rejection, hypersensitive to shifts in tone or attention, and hyper-independent in ways that look mature but stem from emotional deprivation rather than strength. And as they move into adolescence and adulthood, these internal adaptations begin to show up in ways they don't always notice or understand. To see how these early experiences manifest in the real world, how they shape relationships, self-esteem, and the ability to trust, we must follow the neglected child into their adult life and observe what that early silence grows into. When a child grows up accustomed to being emotionally overlooked, the patterns they form in silence inevitably reappear in adulthood. They enter relationships carrying an invisible script, one that tells them not to take up too much space, not to speak too loudly, not to expect too much. Self-worth becomes conditional, measured by how little they ask for and how well they accommodate others. As a result, many adults shaped by early neglect struggle in ways they cannot fully articulate. They downplay their achievements, hesitate to share their inner world, and often feel undeserving of meaningful connection. Even in moments of success, a part of them waits for the applause to fade or for someone to dismiss what they've done. because that is what the past taught them to anticipate. Some become avoidant in love and friendship, convinced that closeness only sets the stage for disappointment. Others swing to the opposite extreme, chasing external validation with an intensity that masks an internal emptiness. They become people pleasers, craving recognition yet terrified of losing it. They apologize before speaking, shrink their preferences, and mold themselves to maintain harmony, even at the cost of their own identity. These are not personality quirks. They are survival strategies formed long before they understood they were using them. Perhaps one of the most telling signs lies in how they handle their own accomplishments. A child who once brought home a drawing only to be met with silence often grows into an adult who instinctively dismisses their achievements. They say, "It's nothing," or "Anyone could have done it," even when the world praises them. They preemptively dim their own victories because they learned long ago that their joy did not matter enough to be seen. This emotional template also fuels chronic loneliness, an ache that lingers even in the presence of friends or partners. Research from the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry highlights how early emotional neglect increases the risk of lifelong feelings of isolation. Not because these individuals are truly alone, but because their nervous system learned to anticipate disconnection. The body remembers, even when the mind tries to forget. As these patterns deepen, many also encounter increased vulnerability to anxiety, depression, and difficulties forming stable relationships. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has shown repeatedly that early emotional absence can shape adult emotional resilience, making closeness both deeply desired and profoundly feared. But the story does not end here. To understand why these adults often present themselves as unusually strong, independent, or endlessly accommodating, we must explore the coping mechanisms they developed, those quiet, deceptive forms of strength that hide the very wounds they were designed to protect. One of the most paradoxical outcomes of childhood emotional neglect is the way it produces adults who appear remarkably strong on the surface. These individuals often carry themselves with independence, competence, and resilience that others admire, but beneath that polished exterior lies a history of compensating for what they never received. Their strength is real, yet its roots grow from a place of survival rather than security. It is a strength built in silence, shaped by the belief that if they do not take care of themselves, no one else will. Many become fiercely independent, almost to their own detriment. They rely solely on themselves, not because they prefer solitude, but because vulnerability feels unsafe. Trusting others feels like stepping onto unstable ground. Letting someone in feels like inviting disappointment. So they build emotional walls disguised as self-sufficiency, never realizing that what others praise as strength is often a shield forged in childhood. Others channel their unmet need for recognition into relentless achievement. They become perfectionists, overachievers, people who excel in school, work, or creative pursuits. Their accomplishments are impressive, yet internally they are haunted by the sense that no matter how much they achieve, it is never quite enough. They chase approval not as a luxury but as a source of oxygen, hoping that external validation will fill the space where early affirmation should have lived. But success, without an inner foundation of worth, can feel hollow. They climb higher hoping the emptiness will shrink, only to find it expanding with every milestone. Some go in the opposite direction, adopting a harmony at all costs persona. They become mediators, peacekeepers, the ones who make themselves small so others can be comfortable. They say yes when they want to say no. They take responsibility for emotions that are not theirs. They try to be easy, agreeable, and pleasant, believing this is the only way to be accepted. This people-pleasing mask is not a personality trait. It is a coping mechanism born from the fear that expressing their true needs might push others away the way emotional absence once did. And for those who carry deeper wounds, the response may be withdrawal. They disengage, stop trying, lose motivation, and begin drifting through life in a state of emotional numbness. When ignoring their own needs becomes a lifelong habit, the world slowly loses color. They detach not because they lack desire, but because desire itself feels dangerous after years of disappointment. These coping systems, independence, achievement, people-pleasing, withdrawal, are not signs of weakness. They are creative attempts by a child to survive emotional starvation. but they also become barriers in adulthood, preventing genuine connection and self-understanding. To understand why so many neglected children never speak up about their pain, we must explore the silent burden they carry. A burden made heavier by the belief that their story is not valid enough to be told. One of the most heartbreaking truths about emotionally neglected children is that they rarely tell their story, not because they don't feel the pain, but because they believe the pain doesn't count. Unlike experiences marked by visible trauma, emotional neglect leaves no dramatic memories to point to. There is no single moment to describe, no event to justify the sadness, no scene that convinces others, or even themselves, that something real happened. Instead, there is only the slow accumulation of silence, the absence of being noticed, the emotional emptiness that becomes so normal that they stop questioning it. And because nothing bad happened in an obvious way, they grow up believing that nothing significant was lost. This belief becomes a second layer of neglect, one that they inflict on themselves. When they feel lonely, they dismiss it. When they feel overwhelmed, they hide it. When they feel unseen, they scold themselves for wanting too much. They tell themselves they should be grateful because others had it worse, and in doing so, they invalidate their own emotional reality. This self-denial becomes a habit, a quiet prison built from minimizing thoughts. It is not that they do not hurt, it is that they feel unworthy of their own hurt. Their silence is also fueled by fear that if they reach out for help, they will once again be ignored. Vulnerability for them is not simply a risk, it is a return to the original wound. Seeking support requires trust, but trust was the very thing their childhood eroded, so they keep their pain hidden beneath competence, humor, rebellion, or stoic calm. Teenagers especially often express this hidden hurt through behaviors misunderstood as moodiness, defiance, or apathy, when in reality they are grappling with a lifetime of feeling invisible. Even when they sense something is wrong, they tend to feel guilty for wanting attention. They think, "I shouldn't need so much," or "this is nothing," echoing the same emotional neglect they once received. Over time, their inner voice becomes indistinguishable from the silence that shaped them. And because they cannot name their wound, they cannot imagine that healing is possible. This inability, or unwillingness, to speak is not a flaw, it is a learned adaptation. It is a survival response from a time when speaking up yielded nothing. Yet beneath the quietness lies an unexpected potential, a sensitivity developed through years of watching, listening, and absorbing emotions that were never reciprocated. This overlooked strength begins to reveal itself when we explore the surprising, often beautiful qualities that many emotionally neglected children develop as adults. What often goes unnoticed is that the very children who grow up feeling unseen develop, almost paradoxically, an extraordinary sensitivity to the emotions of others. Because they spent their early years watching for tiny cues, small shifts in tone, subtle changes in expression, whispers of disappointment, they become adults who can read emotional landscapes with remarkable clarity. They listen deeply, notice what others miss, and offer empathy in a way that feels both rare and grounding. Their attunement is not accidental. It is the skill they built in the quiet spaces where they waited to be acknowledged. Yet this gift comes at a cost. They become so practiced in caring for others that they forget how to care for themselves. Their compassion flows outward easily, but turns inward only with great difficulty. The very sensitivity that makes them beautifully perceptive can also make them painfully self-sacrificing. The path toward healing begins with reclaiming something many of them have never allowed themselves to feel: the belief that their needs are valid. Healing does not start with dramatic breakthroughs but with small acts of self-recognition. Whispering to themselves, "What happened to me mattered." Allowing themselves to celebrate small wins, even when their instinct is to downplay them. Giving their feelings language, even if only in a journal. Speaking up, softly at first, then more steadily, until the sound of their own voice becomes familiar instead of frightening. Neuroscience reminds us that the brain can relearn safety through repetition. Every time they express a need and someone responds with care. Every time they set a boundary and it is respected. Every time they choose honesty over silence. The nervous system rewires itself toward trust. These moments seem small, but they are quiet revolutions, the kind that reshape a self from the inside out. And when a person who grew up neglected begins to heal, something profound happens. The generational cycle loosens. Many parents who neglect are themselves former neglected children, repeating a pattern they never learned to name. Understanding this truth is not an excuse but a key, unlocking the empathy needed to step out of inherited silence. When someone who once felt invisible learns to listen to themselves, they become a different kind of partner, a different kind of friend, a different kind of parent. Healing does not stay contained, it radiates, often touching people who never knew to call it healing at all. This journey ultimately leads to a powerful realization: they were never actually invisible. They were simply waiting for someone, perhaps even themselves, to notice the child who kept shrinking to survive. Their story is not about erasing the past but about offering themselves the attention, tenderness, and presence they always deserved. And in doing so, they prove something quietly extraordinary. Those who were once ignored often become the very people who refuse to ignore the pain of others, turning their wounds into a testament that they have always mattered.